Thank you for an informative couple of presentations. I'd just like to point out I fully support your ideas and goals, but one of the things I noticed in the last financial paper or two, you may or may not be aware that the state government has sold on a 99-year lease the private operation of the Newcastle port. Newcastle port has 4 coal loaders, and if you fly to Brisbane you'll see them all waiting their turn in the queue. That business has just achieved a certain amount of fame by putting up the port costs to the coal shippers by some couple of 100%, and they have a 99-year lease, and the government is getting some fairly hefty return from the venture. So apart from shifting your money, how are we going to shift the government?
It's a very good question. I don't have an answer to that, and I'm sort of mystified in Australia at the level of which we've turned towards not caring about issues like this in terms of how we vote. But the one bright spot was the Queensland election. It was a surprise to everyone, and there's simply no doubt in my mind that not only the reef aspect, but the selling off of assets was a critical part of why people had had enough of Campbell Newman. And New South Wales saw a couple of seats in particular go from Nationals to Greens, most peculiar. And now we have the Nationals turning their position on coal seam gas to support local farmers and to say, you know, I've gone 100% to the other side because my electorate doesn't want it. So there is a certain element of it starting to bite where local communities are saying, you can't be doing this in my community, you won't get my support. But I think federally, and my biggest concern is the run-up to Paris, how much damage will Australia do as we head in to try and play the mouthpiece for the fossil fuel industry, as Canada will, amongst an entire selection of 190 nations who are there to try and figure out how to come to some agreement. And I don't have an answer for that. And if anyone does, please come see me. It's a real worry. Taking away their political power is critical, but it's very difficult to motivate people to care enough to get active on this particular issue quickly.
Yeah, I'll just add that, and that gets back to this point about it being much more of a sort of a moral campaign than a financial campaign, that programs like divestment and other attempts to sort of improve climate change awareness in the general population are about recalibrating our understanding of the fossil fuel sector, and in Australia obviously the coal mining industry, which we have taken for granted as sort of a core part of our economy for decades and decades. So it's systemically embedded in pretty well everything we do in Australia. While most of our electricity comes from coal-fired power, we make a mozza out of exporting coal all around the world. We're the second biggest exporter of coal in the world, I think second to Indonesia. So how do you turn that around? There's no easy answer. You have to try and turn that around through politics. And how do you shape politics? Well, it really has to come through social movements and general awareness. And that's why I'm generally pretty pessimistic on climate change, to be brutally honest. But in this space, one of the few areas where I am optimistic is a grassroots social movement like divestment and some of the other things that, for instance, Naomi Klein's written about in the back end of her recent book. I don't have a whole lot of optimism with established beltway politics, and I think most of the major political parties are thoroughly corrupted by the revolving doors you seem to see between the fossil fuel industry and the Labor and Liberal parties. So yeah, it's grim, and there's lots of examples like the Newcastle coal loader all around the place. And how do you turn that around? I don't know what the easy answer is, but we have to start with a reconsideration of the role of fossil fuels and our easy assumption that these are things we must have, and business as usual continue ad infinitum. It clearly won't. In the next 10 years, we're going to see some pretty fundamental changes physically and politically.
Arthur, Chesterfield Evans. I can't see myself, if you look at the moral issue as no problem, but as an economic issue, I can't see how the amount of capital that we have to divest can affect such an embedded and vital force. I was involved in the fight against the tobacco industry, and people talked about divestment, but all it meant is the people who still had shares just got their dividends go up as the price went down. So, I mean, I'd like you to comment on whether you really think the order of magnitude of the moral people is enough to actually be more than a flea bite. And secondly, I'm optimistic, just going back to economics again, that the Tesla battery will actually outprice them. And if that happens, and the networks are no longer needed, and the price of solar comes down, I'm much more optimistic about that than I am about any divestment campaign. I wonder if you should just stick to the moral issue in the divestment.
I think we more or less have stuck to the moral issue. We're not trying to cut into the financials. But you have to say, like, when the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, which I think, if I remember correctly, is $900 million, they're likely to divest this year. So when the largest sovereign wealth fund decides to divest, it sends a market message. It's not necessarily a pulling out from under all of the financials, but it sends a market message. And I think it's the market message that's really been most consistent in the campaign. When people like HSBC 2 weeks ago told all of its investors, we're going to tell you right now, stop investing in fossil fuels. You will get in trouble. You will be stranded. So I think it's difficult to pick apart the sheer amount of money with the market fear and the market message and the moral issue and the speed of the campaign. And interestingly, you mentioned Tesla as a perfect example. If you put together the perfect storm of the lowest coal price in 40 years, the Tesla battery and the reduction of price of renewables coming significantly around the world in all areas, reducing energy costs, plus divestment, is a pretty frightening package. And that's what's shifting fossil fuel thinking, I think, and makes me optimistic.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my talk I was explicitly stating that I don't think the financial argument actually, that I'd agree with some of the criticisms he made, but in a sense my argument was that's a distraction, that's not really where this campaign's targeted, and it's targeted at delegitimising the power and the political position that major fossil fuel companies have, particularly in North America and Europe and elsewhere. Now, whether that'll be successful or not is another matter, I guess. But I think what really struck me reading, say, David Roberts' article and Naomi Klein's book and others about this is that it's a sort of a fundamental shift in our understanding of the nature of fossil fuels that up till now we've just sort of taken for granted. Fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, great. It's built the prosperity since the Industrial Revolution upon which our modern society is based, and there's no problem. We can keep doing that ad infinitum and there'll be no consequences. And it's clear the science is saying there are going to be huge consequences, cataclysmic consequences if we continue doing what we're doing. And it's that disconnect between what the science is telling us and the political assumption of business as usual that I think divestment cuts into. So yeah, in terms of optimism, pessimism, well, look, yeah, Tesla, the Powerball or whatever it's called, that's great, you know, fantastic. The rapidly diminishing cost of solar photovoltaic power is fantastic too. For some reality check on all this, just sort of swinging to pessimism again, you might want to have a look at a talk that Kevin Anderson did at Manchester University's with the Tyndall Centre, and he looked at what it would take economically to come in under 2 degrees. And what he's basically, he's a climate scientist, but basically modelled what would be involved if we take the budget seriously. His argument is we need economic degrowth at a scale that the Soviet Union saw when it collapsed. Now, I don't know many modern Western industrialised societies that are up for that sort of level of cataclysmic economic change, but that's sort of what he's arguing. So, I don't know, it's easy to be pessimistic in this space. I hope that technological innovation and green entrepreneurs like Musk and others will be the solution. In any case, I think, as I said, the next 10 years is going to be huge political and physical changes around climate, and this issue is just going to get more heated. So the more political sort of space and investment we can make around divestment, reinvestment, focusing on renewables, the better. The
discussion so far has been about divestment from fossil fuels, but in regard to other environmentally problematic types of energy generation, such as nuclear, I was wondering if there's, in countries which have large-scale nuclear power, I was wondering if there's been any similar divestment movements similar to what's been started with fossil fuels.
Good question. I don't think so, not yet. But I would predict that if, you know, here certainly it's minor, but people keep trying to put it forward as the solution, you know, let's just turn to nuclear, and I'm sure the same battle is happening in Europe in particular. A little less so in the US. I think they've tried, but there just isn't an appetite so much for new nuclear plants. but that would grow out of the same kind of movement here. At least you would hope so. Cost-wise, it's particularly difficult to argue the cost side of nuclear against an extremely low, or exponentially lowering renewables price for energy. So that's the other hope, is that it just doesn't, cost-wise, it doesn't stack up when you add in the various costs for decommissioning, insurance, etc. That generally the state pays and is not put into the the equation as an energy price. But I would like to think it would, but I haven't seen it happening anywhere. France, we're coming to the Paris meeting. It'd be nice to launch it at the Paris COP meeting. They're the country probably that puts it forward as the solution more than most. And it's quite sad to watch Japan go from absolutely not going to go back there after the disaster we had to starting to inch back toward, hey, that looks like it's our only solution. And that maybe is another area where we could do with a good campaign on nuclear. It's a very good question. I don't know beyond what I've heard, but I think we could do with it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, nuclear in green discussions is always fascinating. I know on Twitter it seems to be one of the issues that really gets people very, very excited and vehement. And you have groups like the Breakthrough Institute in California, for instance, these sort of eco-pragmatists or eco-modernists as they're framed, who are strong proponents of the whole idea of nuclear as a coherent response to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and carbon concentrations, etc. We held an event at Sydney Uni, I think, Blair, you were at that one, about a month ago, and Giles Parkinson from New Economy was, I think Ben called it from Oxford, were quite vehement about the cost curve just doesn't work for nuclear, it's too expensive, the French are building some new nuclear power plant for Britain and it doesn't add up in terms of cost overruns, the technology, etc. So I leave that to the people who know the technology and the industry, and they suggest it's not viable. But the other point I'd make about nuclear, I guess, is that there's a long ramp-up period in terms of constructing these things. They're very costly, and we really need dramatic reductions in carbon emissions in the next 10 years. A lot of these nuclear plants probably take 20 to 30 years planning and commissioning to really get them up and running at scale. The other factor there is that, as demonstrated in Fukushima, I guess, when you've got nuclear facilities in parts of the world, and there'll be increasingly more parts of the world like this with extreme weather events, hurricanes, tsunamis, etc., it becomes more and more dangerous. I mean, I've waxed and waned on the whole nuclear thing. I know James Hansen, for instance, has come out in favour of nuclear, and the argument being essentially the scale of the climate crisis we now face, just throw everything at it we can to radically reduce carbon emissions. But on the other hand, we've got the danger that when these things fall apart, the waste is going to be there for millions of years. Well, we probably won't be around for millions of years to see it, but something will be.
Charlie Bradley. It follows somewhat because you moved into the international, and I'd like to have you make further comments about the international aspects, in a sense, the global politics of what is required. And one line in my thinking is, hang on, we've reduced the amount of aid we give to Indonesia. At the same time, our Commonwealth Bank is looking to compete with them more vigorously in the coal. On the other hand, if we don't open the basin, that would be enabling the Indonesians to export more coal. And in what way is the divestment? I can imagine some ways, but I'd like you to comment a little bit further. On what way is that sort of process going to change the international economic environment? What's the attitude of the rating agencies to those funds which divest? Perhaps we should be changing the way in which we do our rating and lead to divestment that way. So more comment on that those international aspects.
I wouldn't think we've thought through a lot of the 12 steps into, but we should start thinking about it. On the ratings front, I'm pleased to say that those that are starting to take action are getting a better rating than those who are ignoring it by far internationally. So One of the reasons the mainstream Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Citibank have started to comment and position themselves is all about showing that they're managing their carbon risk against those who are not managing it at all. And it's the big ones like that that have shifted that attitude has been critical to, I think, changing people's attitudes about fossil fuel and why the divestment, part of the reason it's moving so quickly. There's a whole subsection discussion, of course, about in Paris, how much should developed countries support developing to get off of this going the way that we've gone, because we've benefited from it for 100 plus years. They've come in rather late in the piece, Brazil in particular, Indonesia, China to a less degree, but you know they are a shining star for how fast you can change if you have a dictatorship, dare I say it. They are moving so fast to get off of coal for air quality reasons, not for climate, but no doubt that's helping. And to play that role in the international community, to be a leader with America, you know, doing that joint effort together. But I think one of the big problems with an agreement last time at Copenhagen was nobody wanted to put their hand up and say, yes, we are going to have to support developing countries not to go this way. The one positive on that is with the price of renewables coming down, it becomes economically much easier than it was 4 years ago. You know, we're now not talking about having to help them invest in things that were really costly and highly not economical to, this just makes good sense. You know, skip that whole chapter and move into the cleaner options, better for everybody. But there's a whole investment piece around that hasn't been looked at a lot and needs to be. And that's where, you know, I don't get to do it, but others go talking to the Deutsche Banks, the Citibanks, the HSBCs about funds that can be set up that people can invest in to help make that, you know, that bridge. And I think we need to do a lot more than that. And it's interesting because that's a feel-good thing, but if you're thinking about people sort of moving toward living meaningful lives, investing and being part of that's pretty exciting for those who care about it. And all those people who've divested are now looking for the big what next. I already moved my money, what do I do now? Here's something you could do that could really help bolster that demand for investment money to put into those places. But it's a, you know, it's a scary one because you need to move a lot of money very quickly, and so far there's not much of a mechanism in place.
Yeah, just quickly, I guess, the international angle, I think, as Blair pointed out in her talk, Australia has a critical role to play on the international stage. It has played a critical role both for and against responding to climate change. I mean, if we look at the impact that under John Howard's prime ministership in terms of global climate negotiations, pretty profound player, Australia, in terms of intransigence and lining up with George W. Bush on not ratifying Kyoto. So again, possibly symbolic, but very powerful role that Australia's played historically. And again, if we look at more recent past, you know, the coalition of the unwilling, we've got Tony Abbott and Stephen Harper from Canada, you know, lining up against the whole idea of any sort of meaningful regulation of carbon emissions. So when you tally that also with the fact that we've got these massive coal reserves up there that we're about to open up, or hopefully won't, but could, that are almost planet killers, like the Canadian tar sands equivalents, our impact on the global stage is huge, and that's why with the Paris talks coming up at the end of this year, it's so critical that the Australian political impact isn't as bad as it looks it's going to be.
Yeah, make your appointment with your MP now. Go in and have a little chat about Paris and tell them you're worried. We need to be on the good side, not the bad side.
She hasn't. Well, they didn't hear you there.
Could you hear any of that?
No, speaking to the microphone.
I just say, make your appointment now with your MP. Make an appointment to go in and talk about Paris, and tell them you're concerned about us being obstructionists, because it's a real worry, and it's a thing we shouldn't be doing. It's an obvious thing that keeps us out of the international effort, the economic effort. You know, we're on the wrong side, and we should all get involved in making sure that we send a strong message that that's unacceptable.
My name is Bruce Thomas, Progressive Labour Party. Has the Pope made an explicit statement against the burning of fossil fuels or not?
Almost.
Almost, yeah.
The papal encyclical is due in, I think, weeks, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks. We're all hanging out for the Pope because, and trust me, I think he's going to do the right thing. He's certainly led everything he said leads to the idea that he's going to make a very, very strong statement on climate. It will be critical before Paris. think of the nations that are impacted by that, the Catholic Philippines, Brazil, etc. It could play a critical role, and I think it, with all signs so far, when it comes out, it will be a bomb dropped globally, and I can only hope.
Good. Yeah, I just quickly, I gather the Heartland Institute sent Christopher Monckton over there to have an audience. He didn't quite get an audience. He got 9 members of the media turning up for his press conference, and they left about half an hour through. So it was mission unaccomplished.
Jeez, Monckton.
Hi there. My name is Paul Chapman. Can I get you to address some of the moral contradictions that are being dodged in your arguments? The primary one is one of the reasons why this divestment campaign, I think, has some success is because it is able to avoid some of the moral issues, specifically that investment is voluntary. You don't have to invest in fossil fuels, you can move it elsewhere. But for ordinary people, there isn't an option to not turn your electricity on and have it, or use your car. If you're living in a suburb, you have to do that. And studies have found in the UK, extensive sociological, psychological studies, that people are very conflicted on climate change, because they know they're creating more, they don't know what to do about it. So the result is that if you put moral pressure on people where they're not able to react, you won't get a positive change. You have to do other techniques. So are there any campaigns that are being thought about or launched that will actually address the moral conflicts and get more grassroots activity? Because divestment is not particularly grassroots. I don't think it's
Oh, it's pretty grassroots.
Well, there's elite institutions you're talking about.
No, everybody has a super fund, so that's the difference. It's not just about having big investment. It's getting your university or your super fund, and it's interesting when people start going to talk to their super fund, how they start to shift. So uni-super, for instance, is a classic one. Most professors or academics have to have uni-super, or you get penalized. If you choose another one, you don't get as much put into your super. So we did a campaign where we asked, we had a base of, I don't know what the number was, I'll make it up, say 20,000 people that had uni-super who expressed interest in climate change, and we asked them to go to uni-super and say, could you please actually offer a real fossil-free option? Because the option that they had at the time was not fossil-free. They changed it in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So, and it was academics locked in. This is the only choice I have. If I go somewhere else, I get penalized. So if you want to keep me, I'm willing, some of them were saying, I'm willing to get penalized, but I'm going somewhere else if you don't do it. We had a meeting with them. They said, we'll do it. They did it. They followed through quite quickly. So it's an example. Churches and universities don't have a lot of cash, but they do have the moral high ground. And when they make a choice to do it, again, market signal talks about stigmatizing fossil fuels. So it's not trying to be just about people with a lot of money. Although I have to say the foundation side of things, all these family foundations and large-scale foundations, shifting is another sort of the moral side of the story, but significant amounts of money. The one thing I would say on the sort of what you can do front is it's getting possible that you can actually do a lot of things. You can have rooftop solar. Australia leads the world. I think, what's the number we have?
We are leading the world.
We're leading the world in terms of per capita number of people with rooftop solar. They've opted out. They've just said, I don't like either the price you're giving me, or I don't feel good about it. I think I can do something better. And they're moving sometimes with subsidies, sometimes without. I mean, there's a lot of people where they've rolled back the rebates for solar, and people are just getting on with it anyway. So the Elon Musk battery thing adds a whole new element, because it means that you don't have backup, you don't need backup storage. And a lot of people are quite keen on being part of that, because cost-wise it's similar. They see themselves being able to control the cost. It's something they can do. And then you get to electric cars and battery storage and all those things. So there are options starting to come for people, as opposed to just move your money. And I think it's sort of that tip of the iceberg that leads people down a path to start thinking about what their impact is, how they can make a shift, and then choosing options that work for them. So, no one's being dictatorial about, you have to turn we want no electricity for people. No one's suggesting that tomorrow we're all going to turn off fossil fuel and that's the end of it. It's speeding up the process and taking away the political power that the fossil fuel industry has, that has really stopped us from taking action for 25 years. And I think that's why, and it's not trying to be elite in any way, shape, or form. And I would tell you, by the numbers, the most active have been churches, and they're doing it from a moral base.
Good. Yeah, just to add to that, I think that's been one of the problems in the whole debate around climate change for 20 or 30 years, that it's often been framed by government, business, and probably even some environmental groups as a problem of green consumption, that it's all about everybody can make a difference, everybody can switch off their lights and switch to solar. If we all do our own little bit, then the whole thing will be solved. And that completely neglects the systemic way in which fossil fuels are embedded in our economy. And it's a systemic problem, and you actually need government to come in and regulate and change economies such that people have real choices. It's a bit much to ask, you know, ordinary people on the street to suddenly go, well, let's get off fossil fuels and stop driving your car, as you've said. So I know Clive Hamilton has a marvellous bit in his book, Requiem for a Species, where he really gets stuck into the whole green consumption sort of meme, I guess. So particularly in Australia, you know, as I was saying, we're a country with 80+% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power. So we've got this dilemma where you're saying it's up to each individual to make a difference, but there is no real chance to make a difference because the system is sort of fixed. It's fixed towards fossil fuels and business as usual. So you need to have a sort of strategy which tries to change the political levers, and that's where I think something like divestment in harnessing popular power to say, well, hang on a second, maybe the system is the problem, maybe fossil fuel energy, maybe the electricity system we've got is the problem, maybe we could try and push to change that in some way. That's a more viable way to try and remedy the situation.
Yeah, okay. I'm Chandran from the committee. You did give a list of organizations that have done the divestment all over the world, and we have this ANU. It became a public thing with Prime Minister and all the others getting into it. Now my question is, are there other major universities in Australia that are thinking of following suit, and like Sydney and Melbourne, the big ones? And if they did that, I think that will do a lot good. It will do a lot good to this cause. And if they're not, don't you find that a bit strange? Any of you can answer, or both of you can answer.
So Sydney did come out with an announcement, was it a month or two ago?
Yeah,
2 months ago, with a selective divestment from, I can't remember the details of what they've done, but they've got orders to go in and analyse their investment portfolio and identify particular stocks that may be at risk, and it's sort of an argument around partial divestment. There was something on Twitter, Facebook just this morning about Melbourne Uni, a student campaign where they're now pushing for Melbourne Uni to divest. So that movement's happening. I mean, obviously ANU got a lot of press because they were sort of first to move, and they attracted the hostility of the Treasurer and the Prime Minister and the Minerals Council, which was good though, because I think it sort of backfired. And there was a lot of positive press around the fall in the Santos share price after their divestment, so that was a good value.
Yeah, there are 17 campus divestment campaigns going on around the country. Very active, student-led, which is great. The two most likely to move are Melbourne and UTS in a big way, like in a really open and, you know. And because the campus space there is active, they've had good engagement with the management of the university, vice chancellors and others. They often have quite a bit of academic support. The staff support the effort. But 17 in total means that within the next year to 2 years, we'll see probably 5 or 6 come out in some way or another. It's worth noting ANU did it in a very bad way, in that they picked off specific companies and they named them, as opposed to just saying we've chosen a fossil fuel divestment program that equals the following reduction. And so the reason they got attacked was they named the companies, and the companies went, you know, ballistic and jumped up and down and went political in Canberra and said, you have to support us. But it is extremely ironic that after ANU, I believe that the comment from the Prime Minister was, this is stupid, and then the Santos price literally has down, you know, as low as it's been in, you know, I don't know, 34 years. Good time to have moved the Santos shares, like really good time. They did an excellent job. And frankly, probably the other, I think there were 7 in total, 4 of them have tanked. So, you know, you can call that stupid all you like. To me, that sounds like really good investment advice. But, you know, they really got hammered. And to their credit, they stood by it. They made the decision for a reason, and they felt like they had the right reasoning behind it. Student backed it, student body backed it, academics backed it. It's their choice, it's their money. You can't tell any investor, you can't do what you want with your money. It's their money. So, in a way, it kind of opened up that whole argument. The federal government is telling a university it can't make decisions about where to invest its money. That's so sort of back to front, liberal labor, I can't get my head around it. It's just bizarre. But it did open up this question, why are you telling these people they can't divest from fossil fuels when you're telling everybody else they should be investing in the Australian economy, et cetera, et cetera. It's their choice, at the end of the day.
Yeah. One more, last question.
Yeah, I haven't been reading newspapers or watching television news, so I mean, there's a lot of discussion of divestment, but considering divestment on its own does nothing, really. Somebody else picks up cheap shares.
Financially, yes.
And that, if you're buying a share off Shell, they don't care what you buy or sell it for. They've got the money. I mean, I mean, they are doing their business. They've got the money. You're not sort of giving or taking money away from them. So really, the thing about divestment, as I think was mentioned earlier, is that it's taking the moral high ground, and that's it. In any real evaluation, that's it. So there's no point in taking the moral high ground unless it has, what's that?
Yes, there is. There's a great, getting the moral high ground is the beginning.
No. Well, my point is really simple. That the point in doing this is the impact on media, because I'm not paying attention to media and I don't know anything about anything you're talking about until I sit down here. So it's all media, and that's what my question is. Is this a public issue that I'm just not aware of, that people in the streets, people in the bar downstairs are discussing it? It's like elections, where everybody in the country is hugely concerned about the outcome. I don't know.
So what's your question?
My question is it having an effect? And the only way it could be having an effect is if it's in the public arena, via the news. Okay.
Well, I'd argue it is having an effect. In terms of the legitimacy of these large established companies, which have been seen for many years as standards of the economy, unassailable, and now there are large groups of people saying, well, hang on a second, you're actually contributing to the destruction of this planet and the destruction of human civilization. And maybe you aren't as good as you claim. Maybe you're more like the new sin industry. Maybe you're like the armaments industry or asbestos and tobacco. And if you turn public perceptions of these companies around, that has a huge potential impact. The reputational risk, if we use the management jargon, is profound. And most large companies spend large sums of money and very expensive consultants to manage reputational risk.
I'm not challenging that, I'm just asking you if that's what's happening.
Well, I would argue it is. If you look at university campuses, churches, it's probably early days, but public perceptions are changing about these companies. And that will only get greater over time.
I'd just say an interesting example of how it's having an impact. Super funds around the country are now asking these companies, we're having concerns about this, we're worried about stranded asset risk, we're going to have to think about where we put our money. This is a huge financial base, so when they go to speak to BHP, Santos, etc., and they say our super fund members are saying we're concerned about this, we bring these questions to you, suddenly they're being asked a series of questions they've never been challenged on before, at every level. So I just went to a superannuation conference last week. There were multiple people there who got questions specifically on what is your stranded asset policy. And we're going to have to look at whether we're going to stay with you or whether we're going to move our money. That in and of itself is a scary factor for companies like Santos or BHP or Whitehaven Coal, which is a pure play coal company. So in that's just one example. When you've got, what was my total, like 75 churches around the world, or the Norwegian Sovereign Fund starting to question whether it can stay in fossil fuels or whether it has to move all of its 900 million. you know, that does get people talking at all levels in different places. You know, whether you're a superannuation fund member or you're a university student or you're a church-going member and you think, I can't hand on heart, you know, feel good about my church being invested in these things. That's where the dialogue started, and that's where it's moving very, very quickly. So media is a player. Interestingly, The Guardian's been a partner with us internationally on particularly questioning the Wellcome Fund and the Bill Gates Foundation to say, you need to move the money out of fossil fuels. When Bill Gates moves the money out of fossil fuels, it will have an implication. It will have a moral implication, it will have a financial implication, but most importantly, it will stigmatize the idea that Bill Gates can't touch fossil fuels. So that campaign is ongoing, but likely to have a bite. You know, it's hard. Why would he stay there? I mean, he doesn't have to. He can choose wherever he wants to put his money. If the Rockefeller brothers can do it, Bill Gates can do it. It starts a domino effect that, you know, has an impact.
Just quickly, one indication that it is having an effect is to look at the reaction of the fossil fuel companies themselves. So in direct reaction, I'd argue, to the divestment movement, there's been the recent campaign by the coal industry here, Peabody Coal in the US. They hired the best public relations firm money can buy, Burston and Marsteller, who came up with this energy poverty line that said, moral claim, coal companies aren't the devil, coal companies are good. They're going to save the people in the developing economies from energy poverty. And the head of BHP Billiton came out and said this. It's probably the same one as did our Prime Minister. So I think that's an indication that divestment is having a very real impact, that these people are starting to get a bit panicky about the moral argument. And they're coming back with their own alternative response, saying, yeah, we're moral. We're going to save these poor people in the developing economies from energy poverty. And you have these lavish campaigns with photos of kids on bicycles with a laptop under their arm because they've got coal-fired power. So it's a furphy, but it's an indication of that moral debate that's now going on.
Yes. Yeah, just commenting on what you just said, I read or heard somewhere that no less a conservative than John Hewson recently came out with the comment that given the fear amongst large financial institutions like the Deutsche Bank, changes in China, that Australia's myopic, reactionary, backward obsession with carbon extraction and dependence on fossil fuels may leave Australia with stranded assets in the future as the rest of the world moves forward. There are changes happening. What is the likelihood of that? That would be poetic justice, I think.
That's a good way to finish off this evening. I just want to make one more point. I worked in the finance industry, and I can tell you what a fact, that banks like Citibank do take into consideration the global or the large environmental impact of their loans. And I know that's what's happening. That's what's leading Hong Kong Bank to get out of coal. It's a mature industry, meaning its future is going down the gurgle. There are startup industries that are coming. We haven't touched on that tonight, but that's where the future lies. And that's why I think I'm very positive, despite what you may think, I'm very positive about this, even more so after listening to our two speakers. So I want you to put your hands together and thank them very much for this evening.